The chain snapped with a sound like a snapping bone, and Ursa Bonecrusher did not scream, though the iron had torn a strip of skin from her wrist to do it. She crouched low behind the wheel of the slave cart, chest heaving, rain sheeting sideways across the muddy yard of the Crossroads Inn, and watched the nearest guard slump against the fence post where she had put him. He would wake with a headache and a story he would not want to tell. That was mercy enough for a man who had walked her in irons for 11 days. Lightning cracked over the tree line, and in that white flash she saw him. Not a guard, not a slaver. A lean man in a rain-soaked shirt, standing in the doorway of the inn behind her, a lantern already blown out in his hand, staring at her with an expression she did not have a word for yet, not in the Orcish she had grown up speaking nor the human tongue she had been forced to learn. He should have shouted for the others. He should have run back inside and barred the door. Instead, Reuben Slater set the dead lantern down on the porch step, quiet as a man setting down a sleeping child, and came out into the storm. "Do not," Ursa said, voice low and rough, the words scraped raw from disuse, "follow me." "They will kill you before you clear the tree line," he said. "There are 6 more of them asleep in my common room and 2 on watch by the horses. You do not know this land. I know how to run. Not fast enough, not with that." He nodded at the shackle still locked around her other wrist, the broken length of chain dragging from it like a dead snake. "I have a file. Come inside." She looked at him the way a cornered wolf looks at an open hand, deciding whether it was a trick or a mercy, and finding, to her own fury, that she could not tell the difference. She had seen this man 3 times over the last 3 days, always at the edge of her vision, while the slavers ate and drank and laughed in his common room. He had brought her water when the guards were not looking, once bread. He had not asked anything of her in return, had not looked at her the way the others looked at her, weighing her like livestock, and that had unsettled her more than any cruelty could have. Thunder rolled. Somewhere down the line of chained wagons, another captive stirred and whimpered in her sleep. "If you are lying," Ursa said, "I will break your neck before they can hang me." "I am not lying," Reuben said. "Come on." Quickly, before the rain lets up, and someone notices you are not snoring like the rest. She followed him, because the alternative was the open road with a chain around her wrist and slavers waking behind her, and because some small, traitorous part of her wanted to know why a human man would risk his own neck for an orc he had spoken to perhaps a dozen words. Inside the inn, the common room was black and close, thick with the smell of spilled ale and wet wool. Snoring men sprawled across the benches. Reuben led her past them on careful feet, through a low door into a back room stacked with barrels and coils of rope, where a single shuttered lantern threw a slit of orange light across a workbench. He found the file in a drawer with hands that shook only a little. "Hold still," he whispered, and knelt, and set to work on the iron cuff at her ankle, sawing at the rivet with quick, practiced strokes. A man who had clearly repaired his share of wagon wheels and broken locks in his years running a Crossroads Inn. Ursa stood over him, close enough to smell the wood smoke and rain on his skin, close enough to see the pulse hammering in his throat, and she thought, not for the first time in her life, how strange and fragile humans were, and how strange it was that this particular fragile thing had chosen, of all the nights of his life, this one to be brave. "Why," she said quietly, "are you doing this?" He did not look up from his work. "Because no creature should be chained to a cart like a plow ox. Because I watched you for 3 days and you never once begged, not even when that fat one with the scar struck you for looking at him wrong. And because if I do nothing, I will have to live with having done nothing, and I find I cannot stomach that." The rivet gave. The ankle iron fell away with a soft clink onto the packed dirt floor. "There is another problem," he added, straightening, wincing as his knees cracked. "Once they find you gone, they will burn this inn to ash looking for who helped you. I have known men like these. They do not forgive being made to look foolish. Then you should stay and claim ignorance. They will not believe that a broken cuff filed itself off in the night." He was already pulling a leather satchel down from a peg, stuffing it with a wedge of cheese, a coil of rope, a skinning knife in a worn sheath. I built this inn with my own hands 9 years ago. I have slept every night of those 9 years under its roof. And I am about to walk out that door behind you and never come back. And do you know, orc woman, the strangest part of all this? What? Ursa said, though she already half knew the answer, could feel it in the charged air between them. I am not sorry. He slung the satchel over his shoulder and looked at her, steady, unflinching, a man who had made his choice and would not unmake it. My name is Reuben Slater. If we are going to die running from slavers together, I would rather you know that much. Ursa Bonecrusher, she said, and something in her chest, some old locked door, creaked open a crack. Do not slow me down, Reuben Slater, and perhaps we will not die at all. The storm broke wide open above the Crossroads Inn as they slipped out the back and into the dark, and behind them in the yard, the first shout of alarm went up. They ran. The rain turned the trade road to soup within 100 strides, and Ursa led them off it entirely, cutting hard into the trees where the mud gave way to root and stone, where hooves would struggle and torches would gutter. Reuben followed at her heels, breath already ragged, a townsman's lungs against a warrior's stride, but he did not fall behind, did not beg her to slow. Behind them, horns began to sound. They have hounds, Ursa said over her shoulder, not slowing. I know. I have heard them baying at night for 11 days while they held camp in my yard. He caught up to her at a fallen log, vaulted it clumsily, nearly went down in the mud on the other side, caught himself on a branch. There is a creek 2 miles east. It cuts through a gorge before it joins the river. If we can reach the water, it will kill our scent. You know this land. I have run this crossroads for 9 years. Men come through selling maps as often as they sell grain. He grinned at her, wild and a little mad with the fear and the exhilaration of it, rain streaming down his face. Also, I have gotten lost in these woods more times than I would like to admit, and a man remembers the places that nearly killed him. They ran on. The horns grew nearer, then fainter, then nearer again as the hunting party split to search the tree line in both directions. Ursa's orc blood ran hot despite the cold rain, her muscles singing with a strength she had been forced to leash for 11 days of captivity. And there was a fierce, terrible joy in simply moving again, in feeling her own body answer her commands instead of the crack of a whip. They broke from the trees onto a shale slope above the creek Reuben had promised, and below them, torchlight bobbed along the ridge on the far side, a line of riders picking their way down toward the water. They have found the creek before us, Ursa said. Then we go through the gorge instead of around it. Reuben was already moving, sliding half-controlled down the loose shale, catching himself on outcrops of wet stone. There is an old rope bridge if it still holds. I crossed it once trading furs years back. The gorge appeared suddenly out of the dark, a black slash in the earth with the creek roaring white and furious 40 feet below, swollen with storm water. The bridge, when they reached it, was a sorry thing of rotten planks and fraying rope, strung between 2 boulders, swaying in the wind like something already halfway to ruin. That will not hold a horse, Ursa said. It does not need to hold a horse. It only needs to hold us. He was already testing the first rope with his weight, and it groaned alarmingly, and behind them the sound of hooves crashing through brush was close now, close enough that Ursa could hear a man's voice shouting orders, could hear the click of a crossbow being cocked. Go, she said, and shoved him forward onto the bridge. What about you? Go, human, or I will throw you across myself. He went, hand over hand, along the guide rope, boots finding the rotten planks with the desperate care of a man who knew exactly how far the fall would be. Ursa followed close behind, and the bridge swayed and creaked, and one plank gave way entirely beneath her heel, spinning off into the dark and the roar of the creek below, and still she came on, teeth bared, refusing to fall. A crossbow bolt hissed past her ear and buried itself in the boulder ahead with a crack of stone chips. They are on us, she snarled. Almost there. Reuben had reached the far side, was already scrambling up the bank, turning back with his hand outstretched. Another bolt sang past, closer this time, close enough that Ursa felt the wind of it against her cheek. She reached the last stretch of rope and rotten plank just as a rider burst from the tree line on the near bank, torch held high, and in its light she saw the slaver captain's scarred, furious face, saw him lift a crossbow of his own and take aim not at her but at the ropes themselves. "The ropes!" she shouted. Reuben's hand closed around her wrist just as the bolt struck true, severing the near side rope in a single shot. The bridge lurched sideways, planks spilling into the gorge, and for one heart-stopping instant Ursa hung suspended over 40 feet of screaming white water with nothing beneath her but Reuben Slater's grip on her arm and his boots braced against the rock of the far bank. "I have you," he gasped, teeth gritted, both hands locked around her forearm now, muscles standing out along his neck as he took her full weight. "I have you, do not let go." She did not let go. She swung her free hand up and caught the edge of the boulder, and between his desperate pull and her own iron grip, she hauled herself the last few feet onto solid ground, collapsing half atop him in the mud, as the remains of the bridge crashed down into the gorge behind them, taking the last of the ropes with it. On the far bank, the slaver captain screamed curses across the roaring gap, useless now, his hounds baying at water they could not cross without riding for miles to find another ford. Ursa lay in the mud, chest heaving, Reuben's arms still locked around her, both of them soaked and shaking and alive, and for a long moment neither of them moved. "You caught me," she said finally, disbelief coloring her voice. "I told you I would not let you fall." He was staring up at her, rain running down both their faces, and there was something raw and unguarded in his expression, something that made her chest ache in a way she did not have patience for, not now, not with hounds baying across a gorge and a bounty surely already growing on both their heads. "Are you hurt?" "No." She pushed herself up off him, suddenly aware of how close they had been lying, how his hand had not quite left her arm. "We should move. They will find another crossing by dawn." "Yes." He got to his feet, offered her a hand up out of pure habit, then seemed to remember she likely did not need it, an orc woman who could crush stone in her fist, and started to withdraw it. She took it anyway, let him pull her upright, and did not examine too closely why she wanted to. They walked through what remained of the night, following the creek's course away from the gorge, putting miles between themselves and the slaver camp. By the gray hour before dawn, Ursa's legs ached with a bone-deep exhaustion she refused to show, and Reuben was limping slightly, favoring an ankle he had twisted somewhere in the flight, and neither of them spoke of stopping until the sky had gone fully pale, and they judged themselves safe enough to risk a few hours' rest in a shallow cave above the creek. "Where will you go now?" Ursa asked, once they had settled, once the immediate danger had receded enough to allow for thought beyond the next 100 strides. "Your inn is lost to you." Reuben was quiet for a moment, turning the skinning knife over in his hands, not looking at her. "There is a fort 3 days east of here if we keep a hard pace. Ashfall Reach, they are calling it now. It was an old border keep, burned in the last Orc Wars and left to rot for 20 years, but the Crown has finally sent settlers to rebuild it, put a garrison there to hold the frontier. My cousin writes the tallies for the magistrate. I have thought once or twice of going to see it. I never had a reason to leave the crossroads before. And now you have one. Now I have several." He glanced up at her, and there was something wry and warm in it despite the exhaustion carved into his face. "A burned inn. A price on my head, likely, once they realize who helped you. And an orc woman who does not yet trust me but who I would rather not abandon on the road to slavers and worse. I do not need you to decide my fate for me, Reuben Slater. I am not deciding it. I am offering it. There is a difference, though I understand you may not have been offered much of anything these past days." He said it without heat, simple fact, and it landed somewhere soft and unguarded in her, a place she had not let anyone touch in a very long time. "Ashfall Reach," she said slowly, testing the name. "Will they take in an orc?" "I do not know," he admitted. "But I know they need strong backs and stronger arms if they mean to hold that frontier against whatever comes at them out of the wild lands, and I have never in my life seen an arm stronger than the one that snapped an iron chain like a green twig." Despite herself, despite the aching exhaustion, and the danger still coiled behind them on the road, Ursa Bonecrusher found herself almost smiling. They reached Ashfall Reach on the evening of the third day, coming up out of a stand of pine to find the old fort crouched on its hill like something half-dead and half-reborn, new timber pale against blackened stone, a raw wooden palisade climbing up around walls that still bore the scorch marks of the war that had ended it 20 years before. Smoke rose from a dozen new chimneys. Somewhere within, a hammer rang against an anvil, steady as a heartbeat. The gate guards saw them coming from 100 yards off, and Ursa felt the change ripple through them the moment they marked what walked beside Reuben Slater. Spears came down from rest. A shout went up along the wall. "Hold there!" A broad man with a captain's tabard and a grizzled beard came striding out through the gate, sword half drawn, 3 more guards fanning out behind him with crossbows leveled. "That is an orc." "She is," Reuben said, stepping slightly in front of Ursa without seeming to think about it, a reflex of a man who had already decided which side he stood on. "And she saved my life twice on the road here, and I will vouch for her before this whole garrison if I must." "Vouch for her," the captain repeated flatly. "Slater, is it? I have heard your name, innkeeper from the crossroads. Had an inn. Slavers burned it looking for us." Reuben's voice did not waver, though Ursa could feel the tension humming through him. "This is Ursa Bonecrusher. She was taken by a slaving band bound for the coast markets. I helped her break free. If that makes me a criminal in this fort's eyes, then I am a criminal, but I did not come here to be turned away at the gate." The captain's eyes moved over Ursa with a hard, assessing weight, the look of a soldier measuring a threat, and Ursa met that look without flinching, chin lifted, refusing to be cowed by iron and crossbows twice in one season. "I am not property," she said, low and clear, "and I did not come here begging. If this fort has no use for an orc who can work a smith's forge, haul stone, and fight better than half the men on this wall, then say so, and I will walk on. But do not point crossbows at me as though I have done anything but survive." A long silence stretched, broken only by the distant ring of the hammer. Then a woman's voice cut across the yard, sharp with authority. "Stand down, all of you. Captain Voss, put up that sword before I have you mucking the stables for a week." The speaker who emerged from the gatehouse was older, silver-threading dark hair pulled back in a severe braid, dressed in a magistrate's traveling coat over practical leathers, a woman who moved like she had spent more years commanding soldiers than sitting behind a desk. "Magistrate Pharaoh," Reuben said, some relief entering his voice. "I did not expect to find you here in person. Someone has to hold this ruin together while the crown dithers over sending real support." She studied Ursa with far less hostility than the captain had shown, more calculation than fear. "You are the orc woman who broke a slaver's chain and left half his hunting party humiliated on the far side of Devil's Gorge. Word travels faster than you two walked, it seems. A rider came through from the eastern road 2 days past with quite the story." "Then you know what is behind us," Ursa said. "I know a slaver captain named Grosk Hallies lost valuable cargo and a great deal of pride, and men like that do not simply let such things go." Pharaoh's gaze sharpened. "I also know this fort sits at the edge of contested land, that we have had raiders test our walls twice already this season, and that I am desperately short of hands who can actually hold a spear or swing a hammer with any strength behind it." She looked at Ursa a long moment. "Can you fight, orc woman?" "Better than any man in this yard," Ursa said, and there was no boast in it, only fact. "Then perhaps you will earn your place rather than simply be given it." Pharaoh's mouth curved, not quite a smile. "Captain Voss here fancies himself the finest blade in Ashfall Reach. Perhaps a demonstration would settle everyone's nerves faster than words will." Voss bristled, but there was a gleam of interest beneath the affront, the look of a proud man who had never been beaten and did not believe he could be. "Magistrate, I hardly think. I think it is an excellent notion," Pharaoh said, already turning away. "Tomorrow, at midday in the training yard. The whole garrison will want to see it, and it will save me a great deal of arguing over supper about whether we can trust an orc within these walls. Later, you will find lodging in the old barracks, third building past the well. See that your companion is fed. She has clearly had a hard road." She left it at that, striding off toward the gatehouse with the brisk certainty of a woman who had already decided the matter, and did not intend to relitigate it, leaving Voss glowering and the guards slowly lowering their crossbows, and Ursa standing in the gate of a fort that might, or might not, become the first place in a very long time she could call something like home. That night in the old barracks Pharaoh had assigned them, separate rooms though only a thin wall apart. Ursa lay awake listening to the unfamiliar sounds of a settlement at rest, the creak of new timber, the distant call of a night watch, and found her thoughts circling back, again and again, to the man on the other side of that wall who had burned his whole life down to nothing rather than watch her dragged in chains. She had known cruelty. She had known indifference, which was nearly as bad. She had not known, in more years than she cared to count, what it felt like to have someone choose her, simply and completely, without calculation, without expecting anything given back. It frightened her more than the slavers had. The training yard at midday was packed shoulder to shoulder with the folk of Ashfall Reach, farmers and smiths and off-duty soldiers alike, drawn by the promise of a spectacle, and Ursa suspected, no small amount of hope, that the orc woman would be humbled and sent on her way. She stood at one end of the packed dirt circle in her travel leathers, snug-fitted and worn soft from the road, a laced bodice of dark hide over a simple linen shirt, leather trousers tucked into scuffed boots, her dark hair bound back in a thick braid that fell past her shoulders, and she felt every eye on her like a weight. Reuben stood near the front of the crowd, arms crossed, jaw tight, watching Voss warm up his shoulders with the easy confidence of a man who had never lost. "You do not have to do this," he had told her that morning over a shared bowl of porridge that had been the first real meal either of them had eaten in days. "Pharaoh will find another way to convince the garrison if you ask her." "I do not ask," Ursa had said. "I earn. There is a difference, Reuben Slater, and I mean to prove it today." Now facing Voss across the packed dirt, a wooden practice sword heavy and familiar in her hand, she felt something settle in her, cold and clear as mountain water. This was not fear. This was the thing she had been built for. "Any rules to this, Captain?" she asked. "First to yield or first blood, whichever comes." Voss rolled his shoulders, grinning at the crowd playing to them. "Try not to cry too hard, orc, when I put you on your back." "You may find that harder than you expect," she said, and the crowd laughed, more at Voss's confidence than at her retort, and she let them laugh. Let them underestimate her. It had always served her well before. Pharaoh raised a hand, then dropped it. "Begin." Voss came in fast, testing, a probing strike toward her ribs that she turned aside with an economy of motion that made the crowd's laughter falter. He circled, struck again, harder, and she gave ground. Let him think he was pressing an advantage, studying the rhythm of his footwork, the way he favored his right side just slightly, an old injury perhaps, or simple habit. He pressed harder, driving her back toward the crowd's edge, and someone shouted encouragement, and Voss's grin widened. Then Ursa stopped giving ground. She caught his next strike on the flat of her blade, turned it aside with a wrench of her wrist that nearly tore the practice sword from his grip, and stepped inside his reach before he could recover, driving her shoulder into his chest with the full weight of her orc strength behind it. Voss staggered back off balance, and she did not let him find his feet again, pressing the attack now, strike after strike, driving him step by step across the yard while the crowd's noise shifted from mockery to something closer to stunned silence. Voss rallied once, caught her blade in a lock that might have worked against a lesser opponent, but Ursa simply overpowered the lock with brute strength, wrenched the practice sword from his numbed fingers, and swept his legs from beneath him in the same motion. He hit the packed dirt hard, flat on his back, her wooden blade resting lightly against his throat before the dust had even settled. The yard had gone utterly silent. "Yield," Ursa said, not unkindly, before I am forced to embarrass you further, Captain." For a moment, Voss's pride warred visibly with the truth lying plain before him and everyone watching. Then slowly, he raised a hand in surrender and something in his face shifted, the beginning of grudging, honest respect replacing the earlier contempt. "I yield," he said. "Gods below, I have not been put on my back like that since I was a green recruit." Ursa offered him her hand, and after a heartbeat's hesitation, he took it, let her haul him back to his feet with the same easy strength that had put him down. The crowd erupted, some cheering, some still murmuring uncertainly, but the tide had turned. Ursa could feel it, that fickle current of human opinion shifting beneath her feet like sand under a wave. Pharaoh was nodding, satisfied, and Reuben was looking at her the way she imagined a man might look at a sunrise after a very long night, and the warmth of it hit her harder than any blow Voss had landed on her, harder than she was prepared for. That evening, the garrison held something between a celebration and a wary truce feast in the fort's newly rebuilt hall, long tables set with bread and stew, and the fort's meager stock of ale, and Ursa found herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, seated among humans who did not flinch when she reached for the bread. Voss, to his credit, sought her out himself, dropping onto the bench across from her with 2 mugs of ale and sliding one toward her. "No hard feelings, orc woman. That was the finest beating I have taken in 10 years of soldiering, and I mean that as a compliment." "I will take it as one," Ursa said, and found herself unexpectedly liking the man. "Pharaoh tells me you will be assigned to the wall crew, given how well you swing something heavier than a sword. We could use someone who does not tire hauling stone by midday." Voss took a long pull of his ale. "Slater, you as well, I hear. Something about supply and stores, given your innkeeping experience. Pharaoh does not waste a useful set of hands." Reuben, seated beside Ursa, close enough that his shoulder nearly brushed hers, nodded. "I can keep accounts, manage the stores, brew something drinkable from what we have. It is not soldiering, but it will serve. Every fort needs a good quartermaster more than it needs another sword arm," Voss said, "especially with what is coming." Ursa's attention sharpened. "What is coming?" Voss's easy humor faded a shade. "Scouts have marked movement 2 days north. A large party, well armed, moving with purpose rather than drifting like the usual raiders we deal with. Pharaoh thinks it might be nothing. I think it might be everything." He glanced at Ursa, something careful in his expression now. "There is also the matter of the slaver you humiliated at Devil's Gorge. Grosk Halleys does not strike me as a man who forgives an insult, and slaver bands like his have been known to hire raiders when their own numbers are not enough for revenge." The warmth of the hall seemed to cool a degree. "Then it comes for me," Ursa said quietly. "It comes for this fort," Reuben corrected, low and firm. "Whatever grudge Halleys carries, Ashfall Reach stands in his way regardless, and Pharaoh will not simply hand you over to spare the walls if that is where your thoughts are headed." "I did not say I would let her," Ursa said, sharper than she intended, and Reuben looked at her, surprised by the heat in it, and she looked away, unsettled by how much she meant it, how quickly this half-ruined fort and its stubborn, unlikely folk had begun to matter to her. In the days that followed, Ashfall Reach threw itself into preparation with the particular fever of a place that has tasted danger before, and does not intend to be caught unready again. Ursa worked the wall crew from dawn until her arms ached in a way that felt honest rather than punishing, hauling stone up rickety scaffolding, setting new timber into gaps burned through by the old war, and more than once she caught Reuben watching her from across the yard, where he oversaw the stores, a look on his face that made her pulse quicken despite the exhaustion in her limbs. Their rivalry, if it could be called that, did not end with the duel against Voss. It simply changed shape, turned inward, became something that lived between the two of them alone. It began properly on the 4th evening, when Ursa found Reuben in the storeroom arguing with himself over how to ration the fort's dwindling stock of oil and pitch, muttering figures under his breath. And she leaned in the doorway and told him, bluntly, that he was wasting good pitch ceiling gaps that would not matter if the wall itself came down. "I have kept a business solvent for 9 years, orc woman," he said, not looking up, a thread of irritation in his voice she had not heard from him before. "I think I know how to manage stores." "Managing coin and managing a siege are different arts," she said, stepping fully into the room. "I have seen walls fall, Reuben Slater. I know where they fail first. Then perhaps you should be up on the wall telling Voss where to place his timber, and let me handle what is mine to handle." The words came out sharper than either of them expected, and for a moment they simply stared at each other across the narrow room, both too proud to back down, both surprised by how much the other's opinion seemed to matter. "You are impossible," Ursa said finally, though there was less heat in it than there had been a moment before. "I have been told." He set down his ledger, finally looking at her properly, and something in his expression softened. "You are not exactly easy yourself, you know. Most people who save my life do not then spend the next week telling me I am doing everything wrong. Most people who save your life are not orcs raised to believe that softness gets you killed." She crossed her arms, but there was no real anger left in the gesture. "I do not know how to be gentle, Reuben. I was not made for it." "I did not ask you to be gentle." His voice had gone quiet now, and he took a step closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating off him in the cool storeroom air. "I asked you to trust that I am not entirely useless, even if I cannot break a chain with my bare hands. I never said you were useless." She found her own voice had dropped as well, matching his quiet. "I said you were impossible. There is a difference." "Is there?" "There must be," she said, "because I find that I do not mind the impossible ones nearly as much as I should." The air between them had grown charged, thick with something neither of them had named aloud, and Reuben's gaze dropped briefly to her mouth before he caught himself, color rising in his face. "Ursa," he started, uncertain. "Do not," she said, though it came out softer than a warning, closer to an invitation, "apologize for looking at me like that. I have had enough of men looking at me like I am cargo. I find I do not mind from you looking at me like I am something else. What would you have me look at you as then?" His voice had gone rough, and he had not stepped back, had in fact closed the last of the distance between them, close enough that she could count the small scars on his hands from years of honest work, close enough that she could feel his breath. "A rival," she said, "who has not yet lost." "Then perhaps," he murmured, "we should settle this rivalry properly." She closed the last inch between them and kissed him. It was not gentle. It could not be, not between two people who had both spent their lives being underestimated and had finally found someone who refused to underestimate them back. Reuben's hands came up to frame her face, and she felt him shaking slightly, not from fear but from the sheer overwhelming fact of her, this fierce, magnificent woman who had chosen, out of everyone she might have chosen, him. Her own hands fisted in the front of his shirt, pulling him closer, and when they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, she pressed her forehead to his and simply stood there a moment, letting herself feel something she had denied herself for years. "Well," Reuben said, a little unsteadily, "I believe that settles the argument about the pitch entirely in my favor." Despite herself, Ursa laughed, a real laugh, warm and surprised, and it was the first time he had heard the sound from her, and he decided then and there that he would spend considerable effort earning it again. They did not speak of what had passed between them to the rest of the fort, not yet, though Ursa suspected Voss at least had guessed, given the knowing looks he sent Reuben's way over the following days. But something had shifted between them, a warmth that neither bothered to hide when they thought no one was watching, small touches exchanged in passing, a hand brushing a shoulder, a look held a beat too long across the training yard. It was 6 days later that the scout returned at a dead gallop, horse lathered white, shouting the news that ended whatever peace Ashfall Reach had managed to find. Riders, 100 strong or more, coming down from the North Road, and slavers among them by their colors. Gras Callies flies his banner at the head of the column. The fort erupted into controlled chaos, Pharaoh's voice cutting through the noise with practiced authority, Voss already shouting orders to the wall crews, and Ursa felt something cold and clear settle over her. The same feeling that had carried her through the duel with Voss, sharpened now by real stakes. "How long?" she demanded, catching the scout by his stirrup before he could dismount. "A day, perhaps less if they push the pace. A day. One day to finish what should have taken a season to prepare." Reuben found her on the wall an hour later, checking the new timber with her own hands, testing its give, and he came to stand beside her without a word for a long moment, watching the northern horizon where nothing yet showed but empty sky. "You could leave," he said finally. "Slip out the postern gate tonight, head south, away from Hallie's entirely. No one here would blame you for choosing your own life over a fight that started because of what he wants from you." "Is that truly what you think of me, Reuben Slater?" She did not look away from the horizon. "That I would run and leave this fort, leave you, to face what is coming because the danger began with my chains?" "I think," he said carefully, "that you have earned the right to choose whatever that choice is. I would not think less of you for it. I would only—" He stopped, swallowed. "I would only grieve it if you went." She turned to look at him then, and the fear in his eyes was not for himself, she realized, but entirely for her, and something in her chest ached with the weight of being loved so plainly, so completely. "I am not leaving," she said. "Not this fort, not you. I have run enough in my life, Reuben. I am done running." He reached for her hand on the wall, in full view of anyone who cared to look, and she let him take it, let their fingers lace together against the weathered stone, and neither of them cared in that moment who saw. The night before the attack, Ashfall Reach worked by torchlight, every able hand pressed into service. Ursa moved among the wall crews like a force of nature, hauling stone that took 3 men to lift, bracing timber with her bare strength while Voss's soldiers drove the pegs home, and Reuben ran the stores with a fierce, methodical calm, portioning out what pitch and oil remained, organizing the fort's meager stock of arrows and bolts, finding, in the crisis, a kind of quiet competence that earned him nods of respect from soldiers who had, days before, looked at the innkeeper with mild condescension. Pharaoh found Ursa near midnight, both of them checking the same stretch of wall for perhaps the 3rd time. "You did not have to stay," the magistrate said. "I would not have blamed you, given what you have already suffered on account of this." Reuben said something similar. Ursa did not look away from her work, testing a joint with her palm. "You are both wrong for the same reason. This is my fight now as much as it is yours. Grosk Hallies does not come only for me. He comes to punish this fort for daring to shelter what he considers his property, and if he is not stopped here, he will simply do this again to some other place, some other person who cannot fight back." Pharaoh studied her for a long moment. "You have changed since you walked through that gate a week ago. So has your fort's opinion of orcs, I think." Ursa allowed herself a small, sharp smile. "Perhaps we have changed each other. Perhaps." Pharaoh's gaze drifted briefly toward the stores where lantern light still burned. "Slater is a good man, better than this frontier usually produces. I hope you know what you have found in him." "I know," Ursa said simply, and there was no need to say more. The attack came at dawn, exactly as Voss had predicted. Riders pouring out of the tree line in a dark tide, torches and steel catching the first light, Grosk Hallies' black banner snapping at the head of the column. The fort's bell rang the alarm, and every soul within Ashfall Reach's walls rushed to their assigned posts. Farmers turned archers standing shoulder to shoulder with soldiers, the whole desperate patchwork of a settlement fighting for its life. Ursa took her place on the wall beside Voss, a heavy spear in her hands, and watched the riders close the distance with a cold, focused calm that belied the thundering of her own heart. "There," Voss said, pointing. "The scarred one at the front, that will be your Hallies." "He is not mine," Ursa said, "but I intend to make sure he never rides again." The first wave broke against the walls like a storm tide, ladders slamming against stone, arrows darkening the sky, and the fighting became close and brutal and fast, Ursa's spear finding its mark again and again, as raiders scaled the wall only to be thrown back. Voss's sword a blur of motion beside her, the two of them holding their section of wall through sheer stubborn refusal to yield. Below in the yard, Reuben ran between positions with buckets of pitch and bundles of arrows, keeping the defenders supplied even as chaos raged around him. And when a raider broke through a weak point near the stores and came at him with a raised axe, Reuben did not freeze. He drove the sharpened stake he had been carrying straight into the man's shoulder with a strength born entirely of desperate necessity. And though the raider went down more from surprise than the wound itself, it was enough. It bought the half-second Voss needed to arrive and finish the fight. The battle raged for what felt like hours, the wall holding, then nearly failing at the eastern gate where the timber Ursa herself had reinforced took the brunt of a battering ram and groaned, but did not break, her own work standing between the fort and disaster in the crucial moment. Then Grosk Hallis himself came over the wall, scarred face twisted with hatred, sword already swinging for the nearest defender, and it was Ursa who met him, spear against sword, orc strength against a slaver's cruelty honed over years of subjugating the weak. "You," Hallis snarled, recognizing her even through the chaos of battle. "You cost me a fortune, orc bitch. I will enjoy putting you back in irons before I burn this whole rotten fort to the ground." "You will find that harder than you think," Ursa said, and drove her spear forward with everything she had. The fight was brutal and short. Hallis was strong, trained, vicious, but he had never faced an opponent who had spent 11 days chained to a cart nursing a fury he had personally inflicted. And when Ursa finally disarmed him with a sweeping blow that sent his sword spinning off the wall, she did not hesitate. She drove her spear haft into his throat hard enough to drop him, unconscious, at her feet, and the sight of their leader fallen sent a visible ripple of panic through the remaining raiders below. "Fall back," someone shouted among the attackers. "Hallis is down, fall back." The tide turned all at once, the raiders breaking and scattering into the tree line as quickly as they had come, leaving their wounded and their fallen banner behind, and a ragged, disbelieving cheer went up along the walls of Ashfall Reach as the defenders realized, one by one, that they had held. Ursa stood over Hallis's unconscious body, chest heaving, spear still gripped white-knuckled in her hands, and it was Reuben's voice that finally broke through the roaring in her ears. "Ursa." He was climbing the wall stairs 2 at a time, and when he reached her, when he saw she was standing, whole, alive, something in his face broke open entirely. "You are alive. Gods, you are alive." "So are you," she said, and dropped her spear, and pulled him into her arms with a fierceness that lifted him half off his feet, and he laughed, unsteady with relief and adrenaline, and held on to her just as tightly. All around them the fort erupted into celebration, soldiers and farmers alike shouting and embracing, the terrible tension of the siege breaking into pure, overwhelming relief. And in the midst of that chaos, Ursa Bonecrusher pulled back just far enough to look into Reuben Slater's eyes, and something ancient and fierce rose up in her, an instinct older than the war between their peoples. "I am claiming you," she said, low and rough, loud enough only for him to hear. "Now here in front of whoever cares to see it. Tell me if you do not want that, and I will let it be only what it was before. But I do not think I can go on pretending this is a small thing between us, not after watching you drive a stake into a raider's shoulder to keep me alive up here." "Ursa," Reuben said, breathless, "I have wanted to be claimed by you since the moment you snapped that chain in my inn yard. Do it. I am not afraid." She kissed him first, hard and certain, in full view of the wall crew and Voss and half the fort's population still celebrating below. And when she finally drew back, her eyes held a fierce, primal light that made his breath catch. "This will mark you," she warned. "It is our way, an orc claiming her mate before her people, though you have no clan here to witness it but this fort. It will not fade. Everyone who looks at you after this will know you belong to Ursa Bonecrusher and to no other." "Good," Reuben said, and pulled the collar of his shirt aside to bare his shoulder, offering himself to her without a flicker of hesitation. Let them know it. She bent her head and bit down at the joint of his neck and shoulder, not deep enough to truly wound but firm enough to leave a mark that would scar pale against his skin, a claiming bite in the old orc way, and Reuben gasped at the sharp, bright pain of it, one hand fisting in her hair. And when she released him and licked the small wound clean with a tenderness that contradicted the fierceness of the act itself, he pulled her back into a kiss that tasted of copper and triumph and something that felt unmistakably like coming home. Around them, the celebration had gone quiet, the nearest onlookers realizing what they had witnessed, and Voss, of all people, was the first to break the silence with a booming laugh. "Well," he called out, "it seems our orc has claimed our quartermaster. I always said Slater was too clever to stay unattached forever." Laughter rippled through the crowd, warm rather than mocking, and Pharaoh, arriving at the top of the wall to survey the aftermath of the battle, took in the sight of Ursa and Reuben still wrapped around each other with a raised eyebrow and the faintest hint of a smile. "I suppose," the magistrate said dryly, "this explains why the pitch rationing improved so dramatically this past week. Not everyone in Ashfall Reach accepted it so easily. In the days following the battle, as the fort tended its wounded and buried its few dead, and began the slow work of rebuilding what the raid had damaged, there were mutters among some of the older settlers, folk who had lost kin in the old orc wars and could not so easily set aside a lifetime of learned hatred. A farmer named Osler, who had lost a brother to an orc raiding party 20 years before, refused outright to work alongside Ursa on the wall crew, and there were harsh words exchanged in the mess hall more than once when someone suggested that Reuben Slater had disgraced himself by taking an orc as his own. Reuben bore the whispers with a quiet, stubborn dignity, refusing to hide the mark on his neck, refusing to apologize for a bond that had saved his life and hers both. Ursa, for her part, met hostility with the same fierce directness she met everything else, standing her ground without apology, letting her actions in defense of the fort speak louder than any prejudice could shout. It was Pharaoh, in the end, who settled the matter for good, calling a gathering in the fort's yard a week after the battle, the whole population assembled to hear what the magistrate had to say. "There are those among you," Pharaoh said, standing on the steps of the newly repaired keep, "who still question whether an orc has a place within these walls. I will not pretend the history between our peoples is simple, or that old wounds heal quickly, but I will say this plainly. Ashfall Reach stands today because Ursa Bonecrusher held that eastern wall when it would have fallen, because she put Grosk Hallies on his back and ended a threat that would have seen half of you dead or dragged off in chains. I will not hear another word spoken against her, or against the man who chose to stand with her, not while I hold authority in this fort. Anyone who cannot accept that is welcome to seek their fortune elsewhere." A heavy silence followed, broken finally by Osler himself, who stepped forward with obvious reluctance, studying Ursa with an expression that was not quite acceptance but was, at least, no longer pure hostility. "My brother died at orc hands 20 years gone," he said gruff. "I will not pretend that does not still sit sour in me, but I saw you on that wall, orc woman. I saw you take a blow meant for my own daughter and never once flinch. I do not know what to call what is between us, but I will not call you enemy. Not after that." "That is enough for me," Ursa said, and meant it. The weeks that followed brought a season of steady, hard-won peace to Ashfall Reach. The fort continued its slow rebuilding. New settlers arriving now that word had spread of the victory over Hallies' raiders, and Ursa found her place within it not as a curiosity or a reluctant ally, but as one of the settlement's own, respected on the wall crew, sought out by Voss for training the younger recruits, her strength and skill woven into the fabric of the community's daily life. Reuben rebuilt something of his old trade within the fort as well, establishing a modest tavern in one of the restored buildings near the well, a smaller echo of the crossroads he had lost, though he told Ursa more than once that he did not mourn the old place nearly as much as he might have expected. "I lost a building," he told her one evening, the two of them sharing a meal in the small quarters they had claimed together within the fort, a simple room with a real bed and a window that looked out over the yard toward the mountains beyond. "I gained something I never thought to have. I would make that trade again without a moment's hesitation. Even knowing what it cost you," Ursa said. "The inn, the life you built. Especially knowing that." He reached across the small table and took her hand, his thumb tracing over her knuckles, the calluses of a life of hard work matching the calluses of her own. "I spent 9 years pouring ale for travelers who never stayed longer than a night, Ursa. I was lonely in a way I did not even have the words for until you broke that chain in my yard and gave me a reason to follow. I do not regret a single mile of that road." She studied him in the lamplight, this ordinary, extraordinary man who had burned his whole settled life to the ground rather than watch her suffer, who had matched her stubbornness with his own, who had bled beside her on a wall and offered his throat to her claiming bite without a flicker of fear. And something in her chest, that old locked door she had guarded so fiercely for so long, stood open now, entirely, and she found she did not want to close it again. "I have never belonged anywhere," she said quietly. "Not truly. My own clan cast me out for refusing a match I did not want, years before the slavers ever took me. I have spent longer than I care to admit believing I was built only for fighting, for surviving, never for this." "For what?" he asked, gentle. "For this," she said, and gestured at the small room, the shared meal, the warmth of his hand in hers. "For someone to come home to. For someone who looks at me and sees more than a weapon or a burden or cargo to be sold. You gave me that, Reuben Slater, the night you followed me out into that storm, and I do not think you understand even now how much that has changed me." "I think I understand a little," he said, voice rough with feeling, "because you gave the same thing to me." She kissed him then, slow and warm rather than fierce, a claiming of a different sort, gentler than the bite that marked his shoulder but no less absolute. And later, when the lamp had burned low and the fort had settled into the quiet sounds of a community at rest, they came together with a tenderness that spoke of everything they had survived to reach this point, every mile run, every blow traded, every wall defended, distilled into something soft and certain between them. A promise made not in words but in the simple, devoted press of skin against skin, of two proud, stubborn hearts finally allowing themselves to be gentled by the other. In the morning, Ursa woke to find Reuben already awake beside her, watching her with an expression of such open wonder that she felt heat rise in her face, unused to being looked at with such naked adoration. "What?" she said, mock stern despite the smile tugging at her mouth. "Nothing." He traced a finger along her jaw, down to the claiming mark on his own shoulder, still visible where the blanket had slipped. "I am only thinking that I never imagined my life would look like this. An innkeeper with no inn, marked as the mate of the finest warrior this fort has ever seen. My old customers would not believe it." "Your old customers," Ursa said, "did not know what they had in you. I am grateful every day that Gros Callies's caravan happened to stop at your crossroads and not some other. As am I." He kissed her palm, reverent. "Though I do wish it had cost you less pain to get here. The pain is behind me," she said, and meant it fully, for the first time since the chains had first closed around her wrists. "What is ahead is only this. Only you and this fort, and whatever life we choose to build within it." A month later, on a clear autumn afternoon with the whole of Ashfall Reach gathered in the yard for the fort's harvest gathering, a modest celebration to mark the season's first real peace since the rebuilding began, Pharaoh called for quiet and made an announcement that drew every eye in the crowd. "It has come to my attention," the magistrate said, a rare warmth in her usually brisk voice, "that certain among you have been placing wagers on how long it would take our quartermaster and our finest wall fighter to make their bond official before the whole settlement, rather than simply wearing it plain on Slater's neck for all to guess at. I understand Voss himself stands to win a tidy sum if they announce it before the first snow." Laughter rippled through the crowd, and Voss, unrepentant, raised his mug in cheerful acknowledgement. Reuben, standing beside Ursa near the front of the gathering, felt her hand tighten around his, and when he glanced at her, he found her looking back at him with a fierce, open warmth that answered every question he might have asked. "Well," Ursa said, loud enough for the gathered crowd to hear, loud enough for Osler and every settler who had once doubted her to hear plainly, "then let us not keep Voss waiting on his wager." She turned to face Reuben fully, taking both his hands in hers before the entire assembled population of Ashfall Reach, humans who had feared her, humans who had come to respect her, humans who had tried in the early days to keep this very bond from ever taking root. "I broke my chains alone," she said, her voice carrying clear across the yard, "but I did not walk free alone. Reuben Slater followed me into a storm with nothing but a rusted file and more courage than sense, and he has not stopped following me since, into battle, into this life, into whatever comes next. I claimed him once already in blood and in the old way of my people. Now I claim him again before all of you, so that none of you may ever again wonder where I belong or who I belong to." "And I claim her," Reuben said, voice thick with emotion but steady, "before every one of you who doubted, before every one of you who feared what we might become together. I would follow her into 100 more storms without a moment's hesitation, and I would burn down 100 more inns if it meant one more day standing beside her." The yard erupted into cheering, even Osler raising his own mug in something that looked, unmistakably, like genuine joy. And Ursa Bonecrusher pulled Reuben Slater into a kiss before the whole of Ashfall Reach, defiant and open and utterly unashamed, sealing before witnesses what had already been sealed in blood and storm and battle. A bond forged not despite the hardship of the road that brought them together, but because of it, tempered like good steel in fire and cold water both. When they finally broke apart, breathless and laughing, the fort's cheers still ringing around them, Reuben rested his forehead against hers, exactly as he had done once before in a muddy gorge with the roar of white water below them. And Ursa felt, for the first time in a life marked by chains and clan exile and slavery and war, entirely and completely home. "No more running," she murmured, echoing words she had spoken once before, though this time there was no danger chasing them, only the warm autumn sun and the sound of an entire settlement celebrating the two of them. "No more running," Reuben agreed. "Only this, only forward together." And in the ruined fort turned thriving frontier settlement that would come to be known, in years after, as much for the tale of the orc woman and the innkeeper, as for the battle that had saved it. Ursa Bonecrusher and Reuben Slater built a life neither of them had ever dared imagine possible, two proud, stubborn hearts who had met as strangers on a storm-lashed road and become, through fire and iron and unshakable choice, everything to each other that the world had once told them they could never be.